The tension in the congressional hearing room was already thick when Karl Rove leaned into his microphone with that signature smirk. What came out of his mouth next would shock everyone watching and set the stage for one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. "Representative Crockett," Rove said, his voice dripping with condescension, "maybe if you had grown up with some actual guidance instead of, well, whatever situation you came from, you'd understand how real policy works." The room went dead silent. Jasmine Crockett's eyes flashed with something that made even seasoned political observers lean forward in their seats. What happened in the next 5 minutes would leave Karl Rove speechless, destroy his reputation on live television, and turn Jasmine Crockett into a national hero. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was about to become the moment when a young black congresswoman from Texas would expose one of the Republican Party's most powerful strategists as nothing more than a privileged bully who had finally picked on the wrong person. The stakes were enormous. Crockett knew that millions of young women, particularly women of color, would be watching to see how she handled this attack. Would she shrink away from the confrontation? Would she lose her composure and give Rove exactly the reaction he was hoping for? Or would she find a way to turn his weapons against him while maintaining the dignity and professionalism that her constituents expected? For his part, Rove was supremely confident. He'd destroyed bigger names than some freshman congresswoman from Dallas. He'd taken down war heroes, governors, and senators with well-timed attacks and strategic character assassination. In his mind, this was going to be easy. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these jaw-dropping political moments. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. The attack was personal, the response was nuclear, and by the end, Karl Rove would be trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, while Jasmine Crockett would cement her place as one of the most fearless voices in Congress. What made this moment even more shocking was the setting. This wasn't some heated cable news debate or campaign rally where personal attacks might be expected. This was a formal congressional hearing, with official protocols and supposed standards of decorum. Yet here was Karl Rove, a man who had advised presidents and shaped national politics for decades, choosing to launch a deeply personal attack on a sitting member of Congress based on her family background. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Rove, who had spent years complaining about the deterioration of political discourse and calling for more civility in politics, was about to demonstrate exactly the kind of behavior he claimed to oppose. But power and privilege have a way of revealing people's true character, and Rove's true character was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible. Karl Christian Rove sat at the witness table like he owned the place. At 74 years old, the man they called the architect had spent decades pulling strings behind the scenes, masterminding Republican victories and crushing Democratic dreams. His resume read like a Republican Hall of Fame: chief strategist for George W. Bush's presidential campaigns, senior advisor in the White House, and the mastermind behind some of the most ruthless political attacks in modern history. But success had made Rove arrogant. He'd grown comfortable in his role as the wise elder, the man who could lecture anyone about politics because he'd been there and done that. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, and his demeanor screamed establishment privilege. To Rove, this congressional hearing was just another opportunity to show off his supposed superior knowledge. Rove had always been comfortable in these settings: committee rooms, TV studios, private meetings with donors. These were his natural habitat. He'd learned long ago that the right tone of voice, the perfect condescending smile, and a few well-placed insults could shut down opponents before they even got started. It had worked for decades, turning him into one of the most feared political operatives in the country. But Rove had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that his old playbook would work on everyone, that his reputation alone would be enough to intimidate a freshman congresswoman. He'd looked at Jasmine Crockett and seen what he wanted to see: someone he could easily dismiss, someone who would back down when faced with his supposed authority. He had no idea that he was about to encounter someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The hearing was about voting rights legislation, and Rove had been called to testify about election integrity. He'd already spent 20 minutes pontificating about the real world of politics when Representative Jasmine Crockett began asking pointed questions about voter suppression in Texas. That's when Rove's mask began to slip. What viewers at home didn't see was the prep work that had gone into this moment. Crockett's staff had spent weeks researching Rove's history, his statements, his contradictions. They'd prepared binders full of documentation, knowing that if Rove decided to make this personal, they'd be ready to respond with facts. Her chief of staff had even warned her, "He's going to try to rattle you. He's going to try to make you look inexperienced or emotional. Don't take the bait." But Crockett had a different strategy. "If he wants to make it personal," she told her team, "then we'll show him what personal really looks like. We'll show him the difference between someone who earned their way here and someone who was handed everything." "With all due respect, Representative," Rove had said earlier, his tone suggesting he had none, "you're new to this. Some of us have been fighting these battles since before you were born." The condescension was obvious, but it was about to get much worse. Across from Rove sat 43-year-old Jasmine Crockett, and she was everything Karl Rove underestimated. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett hadn't grown up with silver spoons or political connections. Her mother worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat. Her father wasn't around much, leaving her mother to raise Jasmine and her siblings largely on her own. But what Rove saw as a disadvantage was actually Crockett's greatest strength. Those struggles had forged her into something he could never understand, a fighter who knew what real hardship looked like and refused to back down from anyone, no matter how powerful they thought they were. Crockett had earned every single thing she'd achieved. She'd worked her way through college, then law school, becoming a successful civil rights attorney before running for the Texas state legislature. When she won her congressional seat in 2022, she didn't come to Washington to play nice with the establishment. She came to fight for the people who looked like her, who struggled like she had, who needed someone in Congress who actually understood their lives. Sitting in that hearing room in her sharp business suit, her natural hair styled in locks, Crockett represented everything the old Republican Guard feared. A young, brilliant, uncompromising black woman who wasn't intimidated by their power or their money. She'd seen men like Karl Rove her entire life. In law school, when professors assumed she was there because of affirmative action rather than merit. In courtrooms, when opposing attorneys tried to dismiss her arguments before she'd even made them. In the Texas legislature, when veteran lawmakers spoke to her like she was a child who'd wandered into the wrong room. But each of those encounters had taught her something valuable about how to handle bullies. She'd learned that the best way to deal with people who underestimated her wasn't to get angry or defensive, it was to let them reveal their true nature, then systematically dismantle their arguments with facts, intelligence, and unshakable moral authority. Crockett had been building toward this moment for years, even if she didn't know it. This confrontation was about more than voting rights legislation. It represented a clash between two Americas, the privileged political class that had run Washington for decades, and the new generation of leaders who'd fought their way to the table despite every obstacle thrown in their path. For Rove, this was supposed to be easy. Lecture the rookie, establish dominance, and move on. He'd done it countless times before with young politicians who wilted under his withering stare and sharp tongue. For Crockett, this was about every little girl who'd ever been told she didn't belong, every young person from a struggling family who'd been dismissed because of where they came from, every black woman who'd had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. The room was packed with reporters, C-SPAN cameras were rolling, and social media was already buzzing about the tension. What started as a routine hearing was about to become a defining moment for both of their careers, and Karl Rove had no idea what was about to hit him. The trouble started when Crockett began asking specific questions about voter ID laws in Texas. She'd done her homework. She had statistics, court cases, and real examples of how these laws affected her constituents. But Rove wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in showing everyone who was really in charge. "Representative Crockett," Rove interrupted, waving his hand dismissively, "you're talking about isolated incidents. Those of us who understand how elections actually work know that these measures are necessary for integrity." The "those of us" was delivered with a smirk that suggested Crockett clearly wasn't part of that exclusive club. A few Republican committee members chuckled, thinking Rove was putting the freshman congresswoman in her place. But Crockett didn't flinch. "Mr. Rove, are you suggesting that I don't understand how elections work? Because I've won 2 of them, and I did it without voter suppression tactics." The temperature in the room rose a few degrees. Rove's face tightened slightly, but he pressed on, clearly enjoying what he thought was an easy target. "Look," Rove said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never been truly challenged. "I've been doing this since you were in elementary school. I helped elect presidents. I've seen every trick, every strategy, every excuse. What you're describing isn't voter suppression. It's ensuring that people who vote are actually qualified to vote." "Qualified according to whom?" Crockett shot back, her voice remaining steady, but gaining an edge that made experienced political watchers sit up straighter. Rove's smile turned ugly. This is where he made his fatal mistake. Instead of sticking to policy, he decided to make it personal. "Representative Crockett, maybe the problem is that you're bringing your personal experiences into a realm that requires objectivity. Not everyone had the benefit of a traditional upbringing that teaches proper respect for institutions." The room went quiet. Even the Republican committee members looked uncomfortable. Rove had just crossed a line that experienced politicians knew you never cross. He'd made it about someone's family, someone's background, someone's upbringing. But Rove wasn't done. Emboldened by what he mistook for Crockett's silence, he continued digging his own grave. "I mean, let's be honest here. Some of us learned about civic responsibility and respect for law and order from stable homes with strong guidance. Others seem to think that emotion and personal grievances should drive policy." The dog whistles were so loud they were practically air raid sirens. Every person in that room knew exactly what Rove was implying about a black woman from Missouri who'd grown up without her father around. He was trafficking in every racist stereotype about black families, black mothers, and black communities. The CSPAN cameras captured it all. Social media was already exploding. Karl Rove was starting to trend, and not in a good way. In newsrooms across the country, assignment editors were making quick decisions. This wasn't just another boring congressional hearing anymore. This was a potential viral moment in the making. Political reporters who had been half watching while checking their phones suddenly sat up straighter. Cable news producers started making calls, preparing to break into regular programming if this escalated further. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side sat Karl Rove, representing everything people hated about Washington politics: the insider dealing, the coded language, the assumption that birth and connections mattered more than character and competence. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, representing the change that millions of Americans had been voting for: authentic, uncompromising, and unafraid to speak truth to power. Crockett sat there for a moment, and anyone who knew her could see the storm building behind her eyes. She'd heard these coded attacks her entire life. She'd faced them in law school, in the courtroom, in the Texas legislature, and now here in the halls of Congress. But this time was different. This time she had a national platform. This time she had the receipts. And this time, Karl Rove had just made the biggest mistake of his political career. "Mr. Rove," Crockett said, her voice deadly calm, "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you suggesting that my upbringing was somehow deficient?" Rove, completely missing the danger he was in, doubled down. "I'm suggesting that different backgrounds provide different perspectives, and some perspectives are more grounded in traditional American values." The committee chairman, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. "Perhaps we should return to the substance of the legislation." But Rove held up his hand. No, I think this is important. Representative Crockett raised questions about qualifications, and I think the American people deserve to understand where these questions are coming from." He turned back to Crockett with that same condescending smile. "I had the benefit of learning about civic duty and responsible governance from parents who understood the importance of stability, discipline, and respect for authority. That foundation shapes how I approach policy. Perhaps that's why we see things differently." The implication was crystal clear. Crockett's single mother hadn't provided proper guidance, her community hadn't taught her proper values, and she was somehow lesser because of it. What Rove didn't understand, what men like him never understood, was that he wasn't saying anything Crockett hadn't heard before. These weren't new attacks or original insults. They were the same tired stereotypes that had been used against black women, single mothers, and working-class families for generations. The same assumptions that said if you didn't come from money, you didn't have values. the same prejudices that equated struggle with failure, poverty with inadequacy. But there was something else Rove didn't understand. Every time someone had used these attacks against Crockett in the past, they'd only made her stronger. Every dismissive comment, every coded insult, every assumption about her capabilities had been fuel for the fire that drove her to work harder, study longer, and fight fiercer than anyone expected. Now, sitting in this congressional hearing room with the eyes of the nation watching, Karl Rove was about to discover what happened when those weapons were turned against someone who had spent her entire life building immunity to them. It was racist. It was classist. It was everything wrong with American politics wrapped up in one supposedly polite package. The moment crystallized something that had been building for years in American politics. Here was the old guard, represented by a 74-year-old white man who had never faced real adversity, trying to use the same tired playbook that had worked for decades. Attack someone's background, question their legitimacy, make them defend their right to be at the table instead of focusing on the issues at hand. But this time, the target wasn't going to play defense. This time, the target was going to show the country what happened when preparation met opportunity, when intelligence met courage, when someone who had earned everything they'd achieved faced someone who had been handed everything they'd received, and Jasmine Crockett was about to destroy him for it. Jasmine Crockett stood up slowly. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and somehow made every person in the room hold their breath. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been underestimated their entire life and was about to remind everyone why that was a mistake. "Mr. Rove," she began, and the calmness in her tone was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "Since you've decided to make this about upbringing and values, let me tell you about mine. I was raised by a single mother in St. Louis, Missouri. My father wasn't consistently in the picture, which I'm sure delights you to hear since it fits your narrative so perfectly." Rove shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going where he'd expected. "My mother, Betty Crockett, worked 2 jobs to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. She cleaned offices at night after working as a secretary during the day. She never complained, never made excuses, and never let us think for 1 second that we were less than anyone else because we had less money than anyone else." Crockett's voice began to rise, not with anger, but with pride. "She taught me that your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your father's name or whether you grew up in a mansion or an apartment. She taught me that integrity means fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. She taught me that respect is earned, not inherited." The room was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. "But let me tell you what else my mother taught me, Mr. Rove. She taught me the value of education, so I worked my way through the University of Missouri, where I graduated with honors. Then I worked my way through the University of Houston Law Center, where I earned my law degree while working full-time to pay for it." Crockett began walking toward the witness table, and Rove actually leaned back in his chair. "I became a civil rights attorney, Mr. Rove. Do you know what that means? It means I spent years fighting against people who thought exactly like you do. People who believed that your background determines your worth, that your zip code determines your intelligence, that your family structure determines your character. I won cases against voter suppression. I won cases against housing discrimination. I won cases against employment discrimination. I did it by outworking, outstudying, and out-arguing people who had every advantage I didn't have." Now she was standing directly in front of the witness table, looking down at Karl Rove, who suddenly seemed much smaller than he had when this all started. "Then I ran for the Texas state legislature and won. Then I ran for Congress and won. Do you know how I won those elections, Mr. Rove? By earning the trust of people who look like me, who struggled like I struggled, who understood that I would fight for them because I am them. So when you sit there in your expensive suit, with your perfectly styled hair, talking about traditional American values and proper upbringing, let me tell you what I hear. I hear a man who's never had to work for anything he's achieved, lecturing a woman who's had to work for everything she's achieved." The committee room was so quiet you could hear the C-SPAN cameras humming. "You want to talk about values, Mr. Rove? Let's talk about your values. You're the man who built a career on divide-and-conquer politics. You're the man who pioneered the politics of personal destruction. You're the man who turned political discourse into a blood sport where anything goes as long as your side wins. Crockett pulled out a folder that had been sitting on her desk throughout the hearing. Since you brought up qualifications, let me refresh everyone's memory about your track record. You were the architect of the Iraq war sales job, weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, connections to 9/11 that weren't real, a war that cost thousands of American lives and trillions of American dollars. Rove's face was turning red. He tried to interrupt, but Crockett wasn't finished. You were behind the Swift boat attacks on John Kerry, questioning the war record of a decorated Vietnam veteran. You orchestrated the firing of U.S. attorneys for political reasons. You turned the Justice Department into a partisan weapon. So let's compare our values, Mr. Rove. My mother taught me to tell the truth even when it's hard. You built a career on lies and manipulation. My mother taught me to fight for the underdog. You built a career crushing anyone who got in your way. My mother taught me that everyone deserves respect and dignity. You just spent the last 10 minutes trying to diminish me because of where I came from. Crockett leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. Rove actually flinched. The difference between us, Mr. Rove, is that I earned my place at this table. You were born on third base and spent your whole life thinking you hit a triple. But here's what really bothers me about what you said. You insulted my mother. You insulted every single mother who's working multiple jobs to raise her children. You insulted every kid who's ever grown up without a father and wondered if that made them less than other kids. You insulted every family that struggled to make ends meet. Her voice rose to fill the entire room. And you did it while sitting at a witness table in the United States Congress, speaking under oath, representing yourself as some kind of moral authority. The emotion in her voice was real but controlled. This wasn't anger. This was righteous fury tempered by intelligence and focused like a laser. My mother may not have had money, Mr. Rove, but she had something you clearly never learned. Class. She would never, ever insult someone's family to score political points. She would never attack someone's background to make herself feel superior. She would never use her platform to punch down at people who had less than she did. Crockett straightened up and looked directly into the CSPAN cameras. So, yes, Mr. Rove, my upbringing was different from yours. I was raised by a woman who taught me that your character is measured by how you treat people who can't do anything for you. I was raised to believe that public service means serving the public, not serving yourself. I was raised to understand that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. She turned back to Rove, who was staring at the table, unable to meet her eyes. And if that's not traditional American values to you, then maybe the problem isn't with my upbringing. Maybe the problem is with your understanding of what America is supposed to be about. The room exploded. The Democratic committee members were applauding. Several Republicans looked visibly uncomfortable. The reporters were frantically typing. And Karl Rove sat there in complete silence, utterly and completely destroyed by a woman he'd thought he could dismiss with a few coded insults. It was over. In less than 10 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had not only defended herself, she'd exposed Karl Rove as exactly the kind of privileged, out-of-touch political operative that Americans were tired of. And she'd done it with the same grace, intelligence, and dignity that her mother had taught her in that modest apartment in St. Louis all those years ago. The committee chairman sat stunned for a full 30 seconds before remembering he needed to maintain order. When he finally gavelled for quiet, the damage was already done. Karl Rove, the man who'd entered the hearing room with supreme confidence, couldn't even look up from the witness table. I think we should move on to other questions, the chairman stammered, clearly unsure how to follow what had just happened. But Representative Crockett wasn't done. Actually, Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Rove should be given the opportunity to respond to my comments about his record. After all, he seemed quite eager to discuss personal backgrounds just a few minutes ago. All eyes turned to Rove, the man who'd built a reputation on never backing down from a fight, who'd destroyed political careers with a few well-placed attacks, who'd been called the architect because of his strategic brilliance, sat there in complete silence. Mr. Rove, the chairman prompted. Finally, Rove looked up. His face was pale, his usual smirk completely gone. I think Representative Crockett has made her point, he said quietly. It was a complete surrender. No comeback, no counterattack, no attempt to regain control of the narrative. Karl Rove had been intellectually and morally eviscerated, and everyone in the room knew it. Within minutes of Crockett's response, social media erupted like a volcano. The clip of her takedown was being shared faster than servers could handle. Jasmine Crockett shot to the top of trending topics on Twitter, followed closely by Karl Rove, though for very different reasons. The video clips were brutal for Rove. The contrast between his smug attack on her upbringing and her dignified, devastating response made him look like exactly what he was, a privileged bully who'd finally picked on someone who could fight back. Conservative Twitter was in damage control mode, but even many Republicans were distancing themselves from Rove's comments. "This isn't who we are," posted one GOP strategist. "Personal attacks on someone's family background have no place in political discourse." Meanwhile, Democratic activists and progressive organizations were having a field day. "This is what it looks like when someone with real values takes on the swamp," posted one viral tweet that was retweeted over 100,000 times. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary Americans who saw themselves in Crockett's story. Single mothers shared their own struggles. First-generation college graduates talked about being underestimated. People of color discussed facing similar coded attacks throughout their careers. Political commentators were calling it one of the most devastating takedowns they'd ever witnessed. CNN's chief political analyst said, "I've covered politics for 30 years, and I've never seen someone's reputation destroyed so completely in such a short time." Fox News found itself in the awkward position of trying to defend Karl Rove without seeming to endorse his attack on single mothers and working-class families. Their evening hosts focused on other aspects of the hearing, but even they couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. MSNBC ran the clip hourly for the rest of the day. "This is what happens when old-school political operatives encounter new-school political talent," said one host. Rove came armed with stereotypes and condescension. Crockett came armed with facts, personal dignity, and moral authority. The Washington Post's analysis was particularly brutal. Karl Rove's attack on Jasmine Crockett's upbringing reveals everything that's wrong with modern Republican politics. The assumption that privilege equals virtue, that struggle equals weakness, and that personal attacks can substitute for policy arguments. Behind the scenes, Republican leadership was furious with Rove. His attack hadn't just backfired, it had handed Democrats a perfect example of GOP elitism and insensitivity. Phone calls were made, meetings were held, and damage control efforts were launched. But it was too late. The video was everywhere, and no amount of spin could change what people had seen with their own eyes. Karl Rove, representing the Republican establishment, had attacked a black woman for being raised by a single mother, and had been completely destroyed in response. Some Republicans tried to defend Rove, arguing that his comments had been taken out of context, but the full video made it clear that there was no context that could justify what he'd said or how he'd said it. Others tried to pivot to attacking Crockett's response as too emotional or inappropriate for a congressional hearing. This strategy backfired spectacularly when clips surfaced of these same Republicans praising male politicians for much more aggressive responses to personal attacks. Democratic leaders couldn't have written a better script. Here was a young, brilliant black woman from a working-class background, demonstrating exactly the kind of moral leadership the party wanted to showcase. Her defense of single mothers, working families, and the dignity of all Americans hit every note Democratic strategists had been trying to strike for years. House Democratic leadership issued a statement within hours. Representative Crockett's response today exemplifies the values and dignity that Americans expect from their elected officials. Her personal story of overcoming obstacles through hard work and education is the American dream in action. Progressive groups were even more enthusiastic. "Jasmine Crockett just showed the country what real strength looks like," posted one major progressive organization. While Karl Rove tried to tear her down because of where she came from, she lifted up everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. The response from celebrities and public figures was swift and overwhelming. Actors, musicians, athletes, and other politicians rushed to share clips of Crockett's response. "This is what courage looks like," tweeted one A-list actress. "When they go low, she goes higher, but she brings receipts," posted a popular comedian. Even some unexpected voices joined the chorus of praise. A former Republican strategist tweeted, "I've disagreed with Representative Crockett on policy, but what she did today was masterful. Rove was completely out of line, and she handled it with more class than he deserved. The moment had transcended partisan politics. This wasn't just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It was about decency versus cruelty, authenticity versus artifice, earned respect versus inherited privilege. The confrontation had implications far beyond the immediate embarrassment for Karl Rove. It highlighted the generational and cultural shift happening in American politics, where old-school operatives who relied on coded language and personal attacks were being challenged by a new generation of politicians who refused to be intimidated. For Crockett, the moment transformed her from a freshman congresswoman into a national political star. Her email list exploded with new subscribers. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Democratic donors who had never heard of her were suddenly writing checks to her campaign. More importantly, she'd proven that the new generation of Democratic politicians could not only survive attacks from the Republican establishment, they could turn those attacks into powerful moments of moral leadership. For Karl Rove, the damage was severe and lasting. Speaking engagements were quietly canceled. Television appearances became rare. The man who'd built his reputation on strategic brilliance had committed one of the most strategic blunders in modern political history. His allies tried to rehabilitate his image, arguing that he was a political genius who'd simply had a bad day. But the video made it impossible to ignore the reality. Rove had revealed himself as exactly the kind of out-of-touch elitist that voters had grown tired of. The architect had built his final structure, and it had collapsed on top of him. The confrontation resonated far beyond political circles. It became a cultural moment that spoke to broader issues of class, race, and respect in American society. Crockett's defense of her mother and her upbringing struck a chord with millions of Americans who'd faced similar dismissive attitudes throughout their lives. Teachers shared the clip with students as an example of how to respond to bullies with dignity and strength. Parents showed it to their children as a demonstration of standing up for family and values. Young people saw it as proof that you could overcome any background and compete with anyone if you were willing to work hard enough. What made Crockett's response so powerful wasn't just that she'd defended herself. It was that she'd defended everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough because of where they came from. She'd taken Karl Rove's attempt to diminish her and turned it into a celebration of American resilience, hard work, and dignity. In a political climate filled with negativity and division, Jasmine Crockett had provided something rare. A moment of genuine inspiration that reminded people why they'd gotten involved in politics in the first place. She'd proven that sometimes the best response to an attack isn't to attack back. It's to stand up, tell your truth, and let your values speak for themselves. And she'd done it all while maintaining the grace and dignity that her mother had taught her in that apartment in St. Louis all those years ago. What made Crockett's victory even more remarkable was how completely she had controlled the narrative. From the moment Rove launched his attack, she had been 3 steps ahead, methodically building her response while letting him dig his own grave deeper with every word. She hadn't lost her temper, hadn't resorted to personal insults, hadn't stooped to his level. Instead, she had used his own weapons against him. His assumption of superiority, his coded language, his attempt to diminish her based on her background. She had taken everything he meant as a weakness and revealed it as strength. Every struggle he'd tried to use against her became evidence of her resilience. Every challenge he'd mocked became proof of her determination. In the end, Karl Rove had been defeated not by anger or aggression, but by the truth. The truth about his record, the truth about his values, and the truth about what real strength looks like when it's tested by privilege and power. If you enjoyed watching Jasmine Crockett dismantle Karl Rove's arrogant attack, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Political moments like this don't happen every day, but when they do, you'll want to be the first to see them. This confrontation shows us that in American politics, truth and authenticity still matter. When privileged elites try to use someone's background against them, sometimes they discover that background is actually someone's greatest strength. What did you think of Crockett's response? Was it too harsh, or exactly what Rove deserved? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political courage looks like. The battle between the old guard and the new generation of political leaders is just getting started, and if this confrontation is any indication, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Moments like these remind us why representation matters, why having diverse voices in Congress is so important, and why we can never take our democracy for granted. As we continue to follow Jasmine Crockett's career and the ongoing transformation of American politics, one thing is certain. The days when powerful men could silence opposition with personal attacks and coded insults are coming to an end. The future belongs to leaders who can stand up, speak truth, and fight back with facts, dignity, and unwavering moral authority. Stay tuned for more moments when politics gets personal and truth gets powerful.